Welcome to Semeion. Yeah, God did that.
Episode 1 The Bucket Orchid and the Bee. The Bucket Orchid and the Bee. The genus Coryanthes are commonly known as bucket orchids, and these are several examples of this most beautiful orchid. There's approximately 42 currently cataloged species so far. I really enjoy the one on the right, which has these fine brown hairs that grow out the top that you can see there, and it looks like a mustache on the top of the orchid. These are native primarily to tropical zones of Mexico, Central America, South America, and Trinidad. All of the bucket orchids rely on the work of particular species of orchid bees. These bees have a unique mating process based on the use of the collection of perfumes to attract a mate. Male bees are attracted to an orchid based on perfumed oils that it seeks to collect to create an orchid cologne so that a female would find him desirable. Some orchid bees travel as far as 30 miles collecting perfume oils for this process. This is a highly specialized relationship between orchid and pollinator. Primarily a one-to-one relationship at that across most bucket orchid species. This means that one specific subspecies of orchid bee services each specific bucket orchid subspecies. The relationship specification based on many factors, including flower color, shape, size, timing, scent, and markings. And the bee size, its anatomical structure, scent sensitivity, and life cycle timing. And all of these factors have to coincide in this unique mutually beneficial relationship between the specific bucket orchid and the specific orchid bee. But how does it work? Let's look at 16 easy steps and requirements for this to work. The orchid bee needs to collect scents to attract a female. The male orchid needs to have its pollen transported to a female orchid. The orchid produces the perfume oil that the bee needs inside a special waxy hood which attracts the bee to come and collect it. The orchid has a bucket that it fills to the correct level with a sticky fluid that the bee cannot escape by flying away. The bee climbs up inside the hood to collect some oil and slips off the waxy surface into the bucket. The sticky fluid keeps the bee from flying away. The trapped bee is forced to use a specifically made escape tunnel at the back of the bucket. A step is provided so that the bee can raise itself out of the fluid and into the tunnel that is just big enough for it to squeeze through. As the bee squeezes through the tunnel, the end of the tunnel opens up, allowing the bee to emerge through the tight opening. As the bee gets to just the correct spot, the opening constricts and traps the bee in position. The orchid applies just the right amount of a special glue to the back of the bee behind the wings and then attaches the only 2 pollen sacs that it will make to the back of the bee. The bee is held in place for 45 minutes to an hour or more so that the glue will dry and the pollen sacs will not just fall off on the ground as it flies away. After the dry time, the orchid releases its grips and the bee is allowed to fly away. The original sticky fluid of the bucket, once dry, is of no hindrance to the bee in its flight. The bee is then, through the course of its adventures, attracted to a female of the same species of orchid and goes through the bucket process again. This time, though, as it emerges from the tunnel, a special hook removes the pollen sacs from the bee and is thus pollinated so it can produce seeds. And the bee can go on to find a female. Now, I do have a video that helps show how this works. Let's look at that now. The orchid bee, in its effort to collect the scents that it needs to attract a female, climbs under the waxy hood of the bucket orchid. The bucket is constantly filled with a sticky liquid from a gland in the flower. The waxy surface of the hood causes the bee to lose its grip and fall into the bucket. The fluid is maintained at the correct level so that the bee is trapped, but not so deep that it drowns before it can escape. The step at the back of the bucket is just the right size to provide leverage for the bee to enter the tunnel at the back of the bucket,
The bee can lift itself out of the liquid, but not so far that it can escape by flying directly out of the bucket. As the bee enters the tunnel, the end of the tunnel opens up, allowing the bee to emerge through the tight opening. After the bee struggles out of the opening to the correct position, the opening constricts, trapping the bee in just the right spot. The perfect amount of glue is applied to the back of the bee just behind the wings, and 2 pollen sacs are attached in just the right spot so as not to hinder the wings of the bee during flight. These are the only 2 pollen sacs that this orchid will ever produce. The bee is held firmly in place for 45 minutes to an hour so that the glue dries completely so the pollen sacs do not fall off. After this dry time, the orchid then releases its grip on the bee and it is allowed to fly on to find another bucket orchid, hopefully in a female phase so the pollen sacs are removed and the life cycle continues as the Lord designed.
Now that is a complicated process, but you might be asking yourself, why does it matter? This super complicated system is not a process that can evolve. A highly refined, multi-stage process is interdependent on such a vast range of factors. If any individual part of it is not fully functional, then it just doesn't work. 2 separate organisms would have to evolve at the same time. The bee has to be just the right size. The orchid has to develop all this incredibly difficult mechanics and triggers. Consider the glue. If the glue gets everywhere, the bee's wings are stuck to its body and it can't go anywhere. The glue has to be strong enough to hold the pollen sacs in place. The glue has to be weak enough to allow for the pollen sacs to be removed. Now consider the sticky fluid in the bucket. It has to be sticky enough to keep the bee from flying away. Not so sticky, though, that the bee gets stuck in it and drowns. When it dries, it cannot remain sticky, or it will interfere with the bee's wings in flight. And this is also a huge commitment for the orchid. It takes about a year for the orchid to grow and develop to the point that it can produce the pollen sacs to start with. Such a long-winded, complicated process is contrary to the constructs of evolution. Never in the course of evolution is it likely to create a process that limits one's ability to procreate to such a mass of limiting factors. We are truly blessed to see firsthand the work of God, the Father, the Creator, in the world around us.
Semeion! Yeah, God did that.